Eye on Culture is sponsored by the Ignatovich Family Foundation.
Eye on Culture. Lesia Ukrainka finished writing her final play, the Orgy, Orgija, 4 months before she died. The central theme of this play is the idea of an artist's responsibility toward art and toward nation. The play is set in Corinth, in ancient Greece, at a time when this city came under the rule of the Roman Empire. The main protagonist is Antias, a bard and master of Greek poetry, who, out of loyalty to his native traditions, refuses to accept the opportunities and wealth offered to him by Maecenas, a Roman dignitary who rewards artists handsomely, though under the condition that they create on his demand and for the glorification of imperial Rome. With the lure of money and fame, Maecenas wins over Antias' students, who transfer from the Greek to the Roman art school to sing in a choir of panegyrists. Maecenas also convinces the sculptor Phaedon to sell his chef-d'œuvre, the statue of the muse Terpsichore, which he created in the likeness of Antias' wife Nerissa, a harem slave whose freedom Antias bought using all of his family's money. Even principled Antias, having been tricked by the fame-hungry Nerissa, agrees to sing at an orgy for the entertainment of the Romans, the occupiers of his homeland. Nerissa dances to his music, hoping to entice Maecenas with her body, and Antias, coming to his senses and realizing how he had been duped, kills Nerissa right then and there, and then kills himself, stating that with this he is setting a moral bar of self-sacrifice for the sake of principle, for his countrymen to uphold. Ukrainian readers and audiences usually consider the meaning of the play The Orgy, with its portrayal of a subjugated colony and imperial aggressor, to be entirely political, that is, a metaphor for Ukrainian-Russian relations. Almost all interpretations focus on the familiar motif of the oppressed nation whose culture is more ancient and rich than that of its occupiers, in juxtaposition with the occupiers, who not only unfairly exploit the native population, but cynically appropriate its achievements and culture. Most Ukrainians, in dwelling on this idea, do not give adequate attention to the more complex themes of the play and the moral questions that it poses. After all, in the Orgy, Lesia Ukrainka clearly shows that the majority of the subjugated nation, with the exception of a handful of principled individuals, collaborate with the occupiers. In exchange for material benefit and personal comforts, they conform and accept compromises. Moreover, with the nation stripped of its dignity, they not only accept foreign rule, but also consider it an honor and an indicator of personal success to be incorporated into the imperial system. In Ukrainka's play, for most of the Greek natives, the Romans not only come to represent power, but are also viewed as social and cultural standard-bearers. And for them, the lavish orgy in Maecenas' palace embodies high style and living the dream. For the dancer Nerissa, the recognition and adoration of the Romans is incomparably more important than the approval and respect of her nation. And at the end of the play, Antias' stance constitutes the only principled opposition to the colonizers. He is the only one ready to stand up for his nation and culture in order to help preserve the dignity of both. If one imagines this metaphoric image as relating to the Ukrainian nation, and if one looks objectively at Ukrainian history and Ukraine's present condition, can one not understand the author's pessimistic critique also as a metaphor for Ukraine? The depiction of a mute majority of a nation and its elites who, for the sake of their own interests, bend to the will of the colonizers and consider the imperial language and culture as better and more prestigious? In such a case, however, how are we to contextualize the pessimism of Ukrainka, who is traditionally viewed as a positively minded freedom fighter, and whom Ukrainians consider to be a symbol of inspiration and hope for the future? How does Antias' suicide in the final scene of her final play coincide with her resolute faith and hope in her nation? Does it mean that she has lost her faith? Not exactly. In order to understand the deeper meaning of Ukrainka's complex dramas, one must first begin by looking beyond the traditional, simple, politicized interpretations of her character, such as the notion of her as a freedom fighter and symbol of hope for a nation. Only in in Ukrainka's poetry do we sometimes find rudimentary political slogans. In her later works, and in her dramas in particular, she always examines more profound drivers of human action. The central element of her dramas is not political. Rather, it pertains to the personal moral dilemmas of individuals in conflict with a wider society that is trying to force them to conform to its demands. Simply put, the overriding theme of Lesia Ukrainka's dramas is the struggle for inner spiritual freedom within the context of oppression, and it is always the individual who has to rise up against an inert society. As a representative of the neo-romantic view of history, Ukrainka does not believe in movements driven by masses, but rather considers that history is shaped by particularly strong individuals, and so the responsibility for spiritual growth in her dramas as well always rests on the shoulders of the individual, whom she encourages to seek personal greatness. In Lesia Ukrainka's view, a person's sense of inner freedom, which is always connected with a sense of obligation toward others, represents the only real basis for counteracting oppression and enslavement. And in the Orgy, against the backdrop of a pessimistic vision of a society with a herd mentality, she weaves a pathetic tale of personal freedom, self-sacrifice, and devotion to higher ideals. And this is the context within which one should understand the tragic finale of the Orgy, that is, that final scene of Antiochus' suicide, which, paradoxically, is intended to set a moral standard of self-sacrifice for the sake of principle, for others to uphold. For Ukrainka, who understood ancient history and culture very well, Antiochus' action resembles the suicide of Socrates, who, having been unfairly condemned to death for insulting the gods with his philosophy, could have avoided punishment by recanting, but rather chose death, in order to teach others by example that the ideals of spiritual integrity and inner freedom demand great sacrifices. The title of the drama, The Orgy, also points to the work's deeper underlying message. An orgy was a sacred ritual of renewal and rebirth, the death of old stagnant ways and the birth of a new life energy, in nature, in communities of people, and first and foremost within a person's soul. As in the tradition of ancient Greek drama, the tragic finale of the orgy is a catharsis, the death of the world pictured on stage, and an appeal for a new life. The spectator, moved by Antiochus' self-sacrifice, is to follow in his footsteps, though obviously not to a physical death, but to the elimination within him or herself of slave mentality, self-interest, and the tendency to conform. Upon leaving the theater, he or she should become a better person, freer and with more integrity and a sense of duty, who is ready, in the words of Ukrainka's contemporary Anton Chekhov, to free himself daily of the slave within. To be sure, understanding these ideas is only the first step to gaining deeper and wider insight into Lesia Ukrainka's plays. In The Orgy, she also, for instance, examines power paradigms in her portrayal of the relationship between the Romans and the Greeks, and between Antiochus and Nerissa. Furthermore, she reflects on the state of inequality between the sexes in her portrayal of the relationships between Antiochus and his wife, and with his sister, Euphrosyne. In general, a careful reading of Lesia Ukrainka's dramas and other masterpieces of Ukrainian high culture can bring much more benefit to a person and a nation than any political slogans or party programs, which are never capable of freeing the enslaved mind. As we have seen, enslavement such as that depicted in Lesia Ukrainka's The Orgy is not an external condition, but rather an internal one, which can only be eradicated by one's own individual efforts. On behalf of Dr. Marko Robert Stech, I'm Tania Stech. See you next time on Eye on Culture.
Очима культури спонсороване фундацією родини Ігнатович.
Очима культури.